Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tech Talk Live. This is Tech Talk Live number 108. This one is focused on governance services, and we are lucky enough to be joined by 3 members of that team. I'll let the guys introduce themselves and kind of tell you their role in the project, but we have David Webster, Tom Page, and Roy Weatherall joining us today, as well as myself. I'm Kristen Gastaldo. I am your community manager. Francesco Corti is here as well. You guys know Francesco. He's our developer evangelist, so you probably have spoken to him on IRC or in the community or in person. He's our most social, I would think, of all of us. Sorry, it's been a while since we talked. We ended up canceling or delaying our last office hours, which usually happens at the end of the month. So our next office hours, our next session will be at the end of this month on August 25th. It's the last Friday of the month always, and it's going to be with our XD team. A lot of you, if you attended BCon, you probably met Lisa Tyerman and that team. They do surveys, they do a lot of user experience, right? They're testing to see how you guys use software, how you guys use our website, how you use our software, and just kind of designing a better experience for you. So if you're interested to see how that team works and see some of the results of that survey from BCon, please come to that event at the end of the month. Other things we have going on, our video project is ongoing with Alfresco Docs. Essentially, that is a community-sourced video project where we want you to help us create the content that the community needs. Essentially, we can provide some tools, we can provide some training, but we'd love for you guys to record short technical videos that would have helped you when you got started with Alfresco, or that you might need now. So we've just had our first one completed. Angel Leroy, thanks Angel, has finished his first one. He created one both in English and in Spanish, which is amazing to serve both those communities. It's great. It's about configuring LDAP, so go check it out in the community. If you're not sure what we're looking for, his is a great example of something that would be useful to the community. Additionally, we have the Hackathon Planning going on. Our global hackathon is going to be on September 22nd. This is something that is organized with the community. You guys, Axel Faust really takes the lead on this, setting up the projects and the teams and whatnot. And it's fully supported by Alfresco, our developers, our staff. There's plenty of projects open now, but we could use more. So if you have an idea for something you'd like to work on, please go put it in the document in the community. If you're looking for the space, go to the community. Community.alfresco.com, and it's under the collaborate space. There's a full page that'll tell you about the project, the current projects available, the people on teams. So there's lots of different ways to be involved there. If you're interested in participating, it's good for experienced people and new people alike. It's a good way to learn and meet our team, meet other developers, just to get involved. I think that's it for my list of announcements. I try to keep it brief because there's plenty of technical content to get to. So I will hand it over to the rest of the guys to kind of introduce yourselves and say what we're going to cover today.
Okay, do you want me to, shall I start? I think I've got the ball initially. So hello everybody, depending on what time zone is. My name is Roy. I'm the product owner for Governance Services. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. So David Webster. I'm now the GS architect. That's a new role I've taken on this week. Been helping Roy with that for a while and just transitioning to that now. So, yep. Tom.
Yeah. So I'm Tom Page. Hi everyone. I've been working on RM for a couple of years now, and I'm also a team lead, so carrying on development as well. So that's me. Over to Roy.
Right, thanks everyone. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I get the dubious honour of starting. So hopefully you can see this in a moment.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, guys. I should have mentioned this. If you have questions, we're taking questions via the IRC chat as well as the YouTube chat channel. So just post your questions there, and Francesco is going to moderate those questions. So feel free to ask throughout the presentation. You don't have to save them to the end.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to sort of break this down into a few bits. So probably what most people, the question I guess I get asked most is what are governance services, and particularly how do they relate to the digital business platform that we're now talking about. So I'm going to go very quickly through that. It's not very technical, but it should give you a kind of an idea of where we're kind of pitching this part of the product, which I think is commonly misunderstood. And then I'll give you a very quick demo for those of you that haven't seen any of our sort of capabilities before, and then I'll hand it over to the guys to dig into some more sort of technical stuff. So this is the, if you pull the slide off of the site, this is kind of what it says. And you can see governance services kind of sits in the framework with all the process services and content services and sits inside that infrastructure. And while this is obviously quite interesting, often it doesn't mean a lot to people, I think. So I'm going to take it back to basics and kind of talk through a case study, a made-up case study. So for the purposes of the next 10 minutes, we're going to pretend that we're a pharmaceutical manufacturing company. Okay, so we're all about manufacturing new and innovative drugs or vitamins or whatever else. And we're going to kind of walk through some of the use cases we might see in a business like that, and how we would use a digital business platform, and specifically which part of that is the governance services bit. So sitting in our back room somewhere, we've got you know, a very clever scientist, and he's playing away with his you know, bits and pieces, and he's thinking and he's generating all this content that we're quite familiar with in order to come up with the dream drug. Now, obviously, it doesn't take great imagination to instantly see there's content involved in this cycle, and of course there's process, there'll be collaboration and all these other bits and pieces that we're used to. But the important thing to remember about this particular content is that it's extremely valuable for this business. Obviously, they don't want to reveal all their secrets, and they don't want anybody else to steal their IP. So that's where the governance services piece can come into play here. One of the features that we offer in our enterprise governance services is the ability to mark and classify documents. So you can think of that as a way of actually applying security restrictions to content where those restrictions are actually carried on the document, as opposed to you know, part of the folder structure environment that they're within. It's literally a case of like stamping a document and then restricting people with clearances. So you can imagine in this example, that would be a really useful tool to be able to partition documentation by project, so you don't you know, get the wrong people in the company seeing it, or just, you know, marking things for different clearance levels. So so the scientist has dreamt up an amazing new drug, but obviously before this can go out to the world, we have to try it on people and analyze what the results were. Now you can imagine, obviously, when we're dealing with particularly pharmaceuticals, the results of these trials are extremely important. And if that drug goes into production and is sold at a later date, we need to be able to come back to these results and guarantee what happened, you know, what was recorded is kind of retrievable and is genuine, and we can actually use as proof that we went through the due diligence of actually doing the trials. So again, element of content here, of course, we're generating the results. You can imagine there's an element of process here as we're going around this kind of trial, this trial process, passing information from person to person. But at the end of that cycle, we want to effectively make sure that that document or documents are official and that they're recorded. And that's where we can use our sort of records management capabilities to take those documents, make them immutable, store them, guarantee their authenticity, and dispose of them when we no longer need them. So now we have a fantastic drug and we're making lots of money. The problem with that is that the FDA are becoming suspicious. So they're going to come to us and make an information request. So they're going to come and say, well, hey, it's great you're making all this money, but we actually want to gather some information to prove to us that you performed those trials and that you actually did innovate and create this drug for yourself. And so it's up to us then to return that information to them. Now, obviously, there's an element now that we've recorded and kept all of that information that we deemed to be important already as part of our trial process. Because it's in our records management system, it's very easy to find, so we can gather it together and we're sure of its authenticity, and we can pass that back to the FDA. Obviously, part of this, literally this process, is to gather that information in a timely manner and prove that we've delivered it. So in that environment, the actual outcome of the process itself is something that we want to record. We want to record how long that process took and what the items returned on that process were, maybe even the version of the definition of that process. So we have all the information recorded that we can go back to at a later date in the same fashion if the FDA questions our response. So you can see as you kind of pull content and process and governance together, they have a very tight relationship and really complement one another. There you go. So, so the FDA go away, but we've had some customers with some very strange side effects, and a doctor sort of shouted foul and said, maybe we should be suing this company. So the judge comes along and says, I've got a case against your company, against this particular drug, and I want you to produce all this information for me about this case so we can assess it. And so again, this is where having all this information stored and authentic and in the right location and easy to find means that we can quickly gather that together. Now, once we have that together, we can actually hold that information, and that means it can't change, and we can it won't be disposed of, and we can pass it back to the judge and say, yes, we've returned all the information we have, and we've held all the information we got, so it's not going anywhere until the case is cleared. And we can also do things like looking at incoming information and adding it to that hold and starting to control all the bits and pieces that we need to in order to make sure that we don't present ourselves with liability in this situation. So that's kind of some examples of how, very simple examples of how we might integrate sort of governance services into everyday life of a digital business platform. This gives you a very kind of high level view at a more detailed level of where governance services sits alongside content and process, and it literally does sit alongside but also utilizes them. And you can see we split them, roughly speaking, into four headers: records management, discovery, classification, and security. So hopefully that's given you a kind of a flavor, if you like, of what governance services from our perspective is about. What I'm going to do now is quickly give you a demo of some of the key features. So let me just switch my view around. I'm going to do this in community. So I think the guys might touch on this a bit later, but we do produce a community edition and an enterprise edition. The only difference between the two is primarily features around security classification and security marks. But in terms of quality, they're identical. And that's an initiative we've been sort of pushing for the last 18 months or so. So I'm going to log in. Hopefully some of this will be familiar to those of you that have worked with Alfresco and Share before. So we ship the governance service or records management module in two parts. One part is an extension to the repository, so a bunch of additional services and REST APIs. And we also provide a share extension, which is what we're going to be looking at here. This allows you to, if you've got the records management module installed, that allows you to create what's called a records management site. And the heart of that is what we call a file plan. So the file plan, think of the file plan like a filing cabinet, almost literally. So this is where all those really important documents that you care about are going to end up. And the taxonomy in here, the structure in here, represents the way that you want to structure that information. Okay, and once this information, so once you've built that structure, you can then start to add retention rules around this structure that allow you to control how long you hold on to things, whether they get destroyed, whether they get moved to other systems, and all that kind of stuff. Just trying to remember where I put. Let's have a look. Let's go and have a look and let's pick up one of these categories. You can see there's a schedule on there already. So let's go and have a look at that one. Give you a flavour for what that means. So it's going to just jump into here for a second. So this is our schedule editor. You can see here, and in this particular case, we've got a very, very simple schedule. Essentially, we're going to cut something off, and then after 2 years, we're going to destroy it. And just in terms of terminology, in order to cutting something off essentially means that at this point the record is complete, and we want it to be immutable from that point onwards. Okay, so and by destruction we mean complete annihilation, right? We will remove it instantly, and it will be, we guarantee it's kind of it's destruction, it's deletion. So you can obviously have variants on that. You can do things like you can have various different transfer options, and we can have a thing called extension, which is a relinquish of control. So there are lots of different ways you can do that, and you can do it by period or event. But essentially, it's life cycle rules, right? That occur in a very controlled way. So let's go and have a look at how we might use this in practice. Now, obviously, this is a very traditional view, and you could just produce a file plan and bring records directly into here and manage them pretty much like most traditional records management systems. But we believe that that transparent records management is a far more powerful paradigm, and that's what we try and promote with what we call our easy access records. So I'm going to jump into a completely normal share site, which is an R&D site for my made-up name pharmaceutical drug. And my team, my R&D team, are going to work in this environment, and they use whatever taxonomy that they want to use. You can see it's relatively jumbled here. We've got formulation experiments and a place for notes. Okay, so if we jump into here, you can see that we've already got uploaded notes for a meeting. And if we go and have a look at the options available to us, you can see we've got a number of additional ones you may not have seen before. We're going to have a look at the option to declare as record. I'm just going to punch that button, and there you go. That user's just declared that as a record. Okay, you can see that it's obviously got a little indicator, and our options have been reduced, and the name's been modified slightly. But as you can see, it's still here, and the user can just carry on with their life now. They can see that it's there, and everything goes on normally. Behind the scenes, what's happened is that document has been moved into the file plan. It's actually gone into a place called the unfiled records, and so this is like a holding pen, if you like, for information that's inbound to the records management team. So now the records management team can take a look at this. They can say, yep, I'm happy that all the information's there. I can complete that, and I can go and file that into wherever I was going to file it into. There we go, meetings. Okay, there we go, Alpha Tech. Right, I can file that into there. Okay, so now that's a filed record under retention management, and that is, oops, pressing the right button. We go and have a look at this. There's my record. If you remember, the meetings record category had a schedule on it. So if we go and have a look at the, oops, sorry, wrong button. We go and have a look at the details of that. We'll see a few things. We'll see that it should be eligible for cutoff, because cutoff was immediate, if you remember. There we go. Naturally, if I leave it for long enough, it will actually cut off automatically. I'm just going to do it manually. Okay. Oh, there we go. Right. And so that's moved on to the next stage, and you can see that it's calculated that the next retention step is Friday the 9th of August in 2019, which will be then eligible for destruction. Okay, so she's going to hold on to this for the next 2 years, right? And guarantee it's going to be there. Nobody can change it. You can't. I can delete it because I'm admin, but you can pretty much guarantee it's not going to change. Okay, so that's a very basic flow through filing a record. Oops, wrong button again. And if we go back, whilst that's all been happening, if we go back to the user's view, remember I'm kind of I'm playing the part of two users here. You'll see that my record's still here, right? So the average user has no idea that that's gone on in the background. I can see that it's cut off, but that's about it. Now that's all well and good. There are some issues with that. First off, the user needs to know when to file it, and that's not always obvious. Secondly, the records management team have to automatically file, have to go in and file all this stuff by hand, which can be overwhelming. So what we do is we use our rules mechanism to make that a bit easier. So I can very quickly demonstrate that if I go into the folder. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a rule to my research team's folder, and I'm going to say that whenever something enters the folder, whatever it is, let's say to keep it simple, I want you to declare it as a record. Okay, so now that means whenever I drop a document into that folder, it's going to become a record. Now, those of you that are familiar with rules will know that if you've got a custom content model, or you've got custom metadata, or any other kind of information on that document, you can actually drive those rules from that metadata. And this is where this becomes very powerful, because you could say, if you had a meeting minutes content type and some sort of metadata that indicated that the meeting was important or with a customer, then that could trigger that rule and you'd see the auto declaration. Obviously, I've kept it very simple here. Let me find my test bars. So if I take, let's just take one of those and it'll be the same. There you go. So I drag that file in and you can see instantly it's become a record. Okay. And that will appear in the unfiled records and so on and so forth. It becomes even more interesting when you start to automate the records management side. So let me just quickly hop back. There's the time, so it won't take much longer on this. If we come back in here, first off, we'll see that that was the record we just filed. So that's all good. And you'll notice that we actually have an option to manage rules here. Right, so we can manage rules on the unfiled location, which means we can actually start to automatically file things and do all sorts of bits and pieces. So if I go and look at the manage rules, you can see I've already added an auto file rule here, and that says if the name begins with FM, and again, apologise, this is a bit convoluted. Then what we're going to do is if it begins with FM, we're going to file it to research trials. And then we're going to use the title as the category and the description as the folder. Okay, you can see that kind of special notation there. That's actually going to use metadata directly in that path for us from the object. And obviously that can be custom metadata as well. So you can start to see that you can build your file plan based on the incoming data and the rules that you provide. The other thing that we allow you to do, as you can see, create full path to folder. That will then, if that folder path doesn't exist, it will create it for you. Okay. Now there are a bunch of other options you can do here that include moving it or copying it. Also, interestingly, you can request more information. So actually kick off a workflow to say, hey, a description wasn't filled in. Can you actually kick off a workflow back to the team and say, this record isn't complete, I need more information. And so when that information comes back or is set on the object, an additional rule will trigger and push that thing out again. So there's lots of options there to automate the incoming records and file them. So we'll show that in action. Just before I do that, I'll just show you. So there's I think it was going to go into there, wasn't it? I was going to go into trials. So you can see all of these are empty anyhow. That's the point I'm trying to make. So let's go back into our site. And as the user, I'm going to be, these are all my trial documents. You can see I've set up the title and description with different information. And I'm going to do this by hand, but again, you can imagine a rule could trigger the declaration. And we can start to just declare those as records. You can see they're kind of disappearing off. Here's another one. And the massive advantage of this is that it's a complete separation of information from the user and the records management team, right? That is all the user has to do, and it's done. and the records management team doesn't need to know where the content is, they just pull it in. One of the things I should say is, those of you that are more technical on the call, what we're doing here is we're not duplicating the record at all, right? Because that would be a bad thing. We want one copy of the record. And what we're actually doing is using a secondary association, but doing that kind of silently. So when you declare the record, we actually move the record into the file plan, which means it picks up all the additional permissions and capabilities, and then we create a secondary association back to this location, and then we use then we add the users of read and write permissions, which is essentially the people in the site memberships. We give them a special records management permission on that object, so they still got access to it. Okay. So we kind of make that all transparent, so it's super easy for the user. So finally, if I go into my records management site, we should see that if I jump into the unfiled records, there's nothing there apart from that record we saw before, and that's because that filing rule got kicked off, and we were able to find the right file. We were able to jump into the trials, and there you can see I've created my FM123, and there's all my trial folders, and there's the documentation relating to that. Okay, and they'll be under the control of whichever a retention schedule is set on that hierarchy. Okay. One final thing very quickly, we also are able to create holds in here. So I can, if I get a request from legal that FM123 has turned out to be a bit dicey and we need to prove that we've tested it to the court, I can create my hold here. That will do. And I can explain why I'm creating my hold. And holds are controlled by permission, so you can control who sees them. But then that allows me to go through and find the different information and actually add that to that hold, like that. And you can see that will effectively hold it or freeze it, and I'll be able to won't be able to delete that under any situation at all. The retention schedules will be kind of ignored, and that thing will stay there until that case is closed, and we're able to take that out of the hold and progress it. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a taster for what Governance Services offers. I haven't covered classification and marks, which are newer features, and there's a whole bunch of stuff around more granular permissions, around capabilities as well that complement the normal ACLs and security marks. But I'm in danger of talking for about another hour and a half on this, and that won't give Tom and David any time to tell you some of the more interesting stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So that should allow Tom to hopefully take control.
Okay, thanks, Roy. So I'm going to try and take you through our code and some of the stuff to do with the repository in particular. So records management consists of 2 AMP files, which are our module format, and we have 2 AMPs for community, one for the repository and one for share. So I'm going to predominantly talk about the repository code base in this bit. So to start with, this is our GitHub page, and if you want to get hold of the code, then you should be able to come here and clone it, fork it, whatever you'd like to do. And you can find in RM community, there are a couple of modules in here, one for repo and one for share. And there's also one for the REST API Explorer, which I'll come on to later. But basically, you can get hold of all of our code from here. You can also see the releases, which we've got as well. So all of our community releases, you can find the code for those on here as well. And we're happy to take pull requests as well. So our pull requests, we've got a process for accepting those. And all of our pull requests get tested. So they're currently being built by Travis. You can see our master branch being built by Travis automatically. And if you push in a pull request, then that will run automatically and give you some confirmation that your changes are okay, so you can have some confidence in them. So that's where the code is. So if you want to work with our code base, then we have a lot of code, but the bits which you're kind of encouraged to use are the bits labeled with this annotation. So we've got an annotation which is actually from core Alfresco, from the content services, Alfresco public API, and you'll find that that's applied to a lot of our services. So for example, here's the file plan role service, which is responsible for dealing with the roles in the file plan. And you can see it's got that annotation on it. So that indicates that this is a service which you should feel free to use in your extensions. And we're committed to keeping that backwards compatible. So if I pick a method in here and I decide I want to use this get roles by user method, then the idea is that we're committed to keeping that signature there in future versions of Alfresco. If we need to get rid of it for some reason because we create a new version, then we'll deprecate it first, and then we might remove it after deprecating it. But the idea is at least you'll get some warning, and our aim is to keep these methods here. So you can find as well, if you get the code, then you can find the implementation of it. So you can see the implementation calls another method called get roles by user, and it does some work, and you can debug through that if you need to. And the way which this is wired up in Spring is we've got the same as Alfresco content services. We've got two main beans, an internal bean, which is kind of the actual bean, and a proxy bean. And this proxy bean has a capital F, the internal bean has a lowercase f, so that's how you tell them apart. Generally, you'll want to be using the uppercase bean, the proxy bean, because that then automatically will include our transaction management to ensure there's a transaction at the right point, and security management to ensure that the right people can call the method. So, for example, everyone's allowed to create a role from this, but only certain people are allowed to assign roles to authorities. So that's how the transaction and security management is wired in. So this method wouldn't be much use. So if you could call this method and you'll get back a set of roles. So it's not going to be much use unless that role is also marked Alfresco public API, which indeed it is. So we've got several classes as well, which are kind of Pojo objects, which are marked with the same annotation to ensure that you've got a consistent experience. And what we've done as well is we've written a test which goes through and checks using reflection, looks at all of the classes which are marked with that annotation, and we'll go through and check that it's a consistent API for you to use. So if I delete that reference and then run this test, then we should see, all being well, that the test will hopefully fail. There we go. So, and it comes up with a message saying the file plan role service needed to use the role. So there was a problem with the API. So I'll just undo that so I don't accidentally commit it. Great. So that's our public API, our Java public API. And what we're missing at the moment is we're missing a test of backwards compatibility. So that's something which we want to add, is some automated backwards compatibility checking, but we haven't done that yet. So that's, if you want to write some Java code that calls through to our services, that's what you'll be looking at. As well as that, we've also got the REST API. So when the repo starts up, there's a REST API available to use, and that's new in 2.6a. So that's one of the main features of 2.6a is the new community REST API. And we've used Swagger, or the Open API spec, to define what this looks like. And the benefit of that is that gives us automatically a nice governance services explorer, which you can go to. And if you've started up Community Alfresco, well, if you started up the repository, you should get this start up automatically for you as well. And you can use it to test against what we've got there. So if you put in, for example, we try and create the records management site, you can try that out. And it says unable to create the site because I've already created it. So let's fix that, delete it first, and make sure this demo works. So they go 204 response, so delete it successfully, and then I'll try and create it again. And this time, there we go. So successfully created. So hopefully that's useful. We've put quite a bit of effort into adding documentation to this, and we're always open to feedback. If you've got some ideas about what we should add, what's not documented well enough, or what endpoints you'd like to see, then you know, we're always open for feedback there. So that's how that works. So as well as the unit tests and integration tests which we've also got a whole load of build plans, and you can see most of these are actually for older releases, so 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, and the reason for that is obviously that there are customers who are paying us to maintain that older code, so we're committed to pushing bug fixes into those branches, and all of those bug fixes will get rolled forward and released out in the latest version as well. So the community version is the latest and greatest and has all of those bug fixes in it, and we're aiming to make releases of community regularly as well. Some of the tests in here include REST API tests and UI tests, and I'm going to cover those a little bit. But I wanted to show, first of all, where that code is, because if you download our community code, you won't find that. And that's because it's in our enterprise code base. Our enterprise code base uses the community code. It depends on the community code, so it includes all of the community code in it. So we're committed to maintaining that community code and keeping that as bug-free as we can, because we're dependent on that, because we're selling enterprise, which has that as a dependency. And so we're writing community REST API tests and community UI tests for that as well. But at the moment, all of those are stored in our enterprise project, which makes it a bit difficult for us to share them with you. But we would like to publish those at some point. So perhaps that's a hackathon project which we could look into. Here's an example. So this is the RM site tests for creating and deleting the RM site. So these are going to call through to our REST API. And if I run those, then we should see that'll run through and call through to the community server, which I've got running at the moment, and check, okay, I can create a site as the admin user, I can create it as another admin user, I can delete it, I can update the title of it, and all that kind of thing. So that's just to give you a bit of confidence that we are testing this API. It is available, but the tests are currently not exposed externally. And I want to show you the UI tests as well. So, for example, if I go into our level 1 UI tests, which are kind of our smoke tests, here's an example of when the build broke. You can see there's one new failure, and it was to do with records disposition schedule. Had a problem with it, so we can debug that. And what we get in Bamboo is we've also got our test result page, which shows us all of the UI tests which ran, all of the ones which failed. And if I go back again, I can also show you the screenshot, so we get some debugging information to help us to try and determine what's gone wrong. So I think that kind of covers everything which I wanted to share with you. So we've got our REST API tests and we've got our UI tests, and so I think that leads nicely on to David, who's going to be talking next about our UI implementation.
Sorry, Tom. Before leaving the mic to David, sorry, David. Just one fast question. In the REST API, do you think all the topics, all the groups, all the services are still covered, or do you still have some big or small gaps in the number of REST APIs that you cover? I remember to everyone that when we went through the REST API for the Alfresco Content Services, currently the majority of the REST API services are covered, but not all the services are covered. How is the situation on the record or the governance services side?
Okay, so we've got quite a good coverage. So from the core Alfresco from the community point of view, we've actually put our initial effort there, and we've produced a pretty consistent set of APIs. So I'm hopeful that what we've got there is actually very usable and pretty complete. If there are things, like I said earlier, if there are things which people really need and are missing, then we can certainly look to add that. Our next focus is going to be to add the same level of API coverage to our enterprise features, because currently that's quite lacking. So that's our next goal, is to try and flesh out the same level of detail for our enterprise API. But yeah, I think our community API is pretty good at the moment, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'll take the mic now and talk about the RM UI, which we've got, as you've seen, that's built on top of Share. So if you want to build your own UI on top of the platform and the governance capabilities that we've got, you can do, and you can use the REST APIs that Tom's shown. But it's probably easiest if you're new to Alfresco, if you get your records managers at least to use the modules we ship with Share. So I've said that the UI is a Share extension. That's not quite true. It's actually a series of Share extensions all packaged up as a single AMP. So Share extensions are different scopes, and believe it or not, we've got 4 modules in the community version and an extra 2 in the enterprise version. So if we log into Share, oh, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Let me do that first.
David, when you manage your screen, I share with you a first question coming from the IRC channel. Okay. One guy from the IRC channel asked that once the AMPs are deployed inside Alfresco and restarted Alfresco, nothing is visible in clear. So is there a way to see if the AMPs are successfully installed and loaded?
Yes, that's actually that's an excellent segue, because that's the first thing I was going to touch on. Is when you log into Share for the first time after you've installed RM, it looks pretty much identical to Share without RM. So obviously, before you install the AMPs, you can use the module management tool on the command line to check the AMPs are installed. But the best way to check within Share that you've got the Share modules installed is if you go to the module deployment status page. That's this Share page modules deploy URL. And then there you can see all of the Share modules you've got. This is just a vanilla 5.2 with RM applied to it. And you can see the 6 RM specific modules. And there's also an additional iCal one that we add in because we ship with a specific iCal version, which shouldn't cause any problems, but it's something to be aware of if you're upgrading iCal or something similar. Then RM ships with a version of that, and that's what that 7th additional module is there. And so now, just wanted to cover quickly what those modules were. So this is the Alfresco RM extension XML file, which is where those community modules are defined. So we've got one module that looks after customizations to the global header. We've then got another module that does extensions that apply everywhere within Share. And we've got a third module. This one looks after extensions that are specific to the RM site. And then we've got a config section that adds config to globally. And we've also got a similar thing for the enterprise version. And I won't dwell too much on that, but that's exactly the same type of thing. And this is exactly the same as you would have for one of your extension modules. So one of the easiest ways to tell if RM's installed is if you go into the Create Site dialog. Oh, selected the wrong option there. Let's just wait for that to load up. There we go. So if you go into the Create Site, if you look here and you've got the option to create a RM site, then you've obviously got that installed. And this will be the first piece of UI extension that most of you see when you're using the RM module. So if we go back to my IDE and we look at the create site.get.js, this is a simple extension to the WebScript controller for the create site dialog. And now if you're familiar with WebScript extensions, you'll know that these are additive. So this bit of JavaScript here runs after the create site controller out of the box, and it effectively intercepts the model element before that gets passed on to the template. So it's worth noting that prior to 5.2, this was a UE component to create the site, but it's been the latest part of Share to be, shall we say, ICARified as part of the work on 5.2, and that makes it really easy to extend. So all we need to do here is just push an extra option into the site presets model and add some extra compliance options here. And so within RM, we've got the option of having a standard RM site or a DoD 5015 site. And all that does is that adds in additional metadata. It uses a different content model, which has some additional metadata on the record for if you're interested in DoD 5015 compliance.
David, one question from the IRC channel. Can we have multiple governance services sites?
No, that's quite an easy answer. At the moment, you can only have a single RM site that's called RM. It is something we're looking at doing on the. It's a feature on the backlog, but I'm not sure when we're going to get to do that. But it's something we're aware of as a limitation.
Okay, thank you.
So, carrying on with this theme, if we go to the template, which I've zoomed into quite a bit, you can see this markup here. This is just an extra div that renders the select box and then pulls out the compliance options from the list. And what that does is, using this markup tag, that targets the fields tag in the share code. So if I open up the share version, that template, you'll see here we've got a markup section with the fields ID. And what we're doing with the RM extension is we're saying after that, add in our additional code. And that's what renders, if we go back to the create site dialog, that's what renders this compliance box down the bottom here. So once you've created the site, as Roy showed you, you've got what we call the file plan. And that's where most of the records managers will spend their time. And this is a customized version of the document library. And this is customized using the standard XML-based customization. So if we open up the RM share config, you can see in here we've got a whole section on indicators that shows you the different statuses of the records. We've got the metadata templates that adds in the specific metadata that correspond back to what you can see in this view here. And this is also where we define the actions, multi-select or single select actions. And that's all fairly standard share extension stuff that you'll be familiar with if you've done any share extensions in the last 5 years or however long that's been around. But as Roy said, one of the aims of RM within Alfresco is to make it as transparent to the user as possible. So a lot of our focus on the UI goes into the admin tools behind that. And we've got 2 sections for that. One is within the site, in the RM site, you've got a specific RM admin tools section. And this is where you can manage the permissions and the capabilities and stuff like that. But what we've also been doing recently is expanding out from just managing records to governing content across the whole repository. And so we've needed an area to configure that within the wider context. So within shares extra standard admin tools section, we've added an extra section here where you can configure and you can administer these capabilities. This is the security control section, and that's probably a good example of this. As Roy said, it's a enterprise only feature, but it's one of the first we've got that expands to content across the whole repository. And if we switch to, let's look at the security groups descriptor. And you can see here we've got the family admin console. That's what causes this web script to display in this list. So it's just a standard standalone web script. And if we then look at the controller, you can see there this is an iCal component that builds this page. And so one of the things I like to think of with RM is that it's a good example of how you guys can take the repo and extend it, and you can use this as a example extension, have a look through the code, get some ideas of patterns to use, and that's probably all I wanted to demo now. I know we're short on time, and I want to leave some room for questions, if there are any.
Note at the moment, questions not from the IRC and not from the YouTube channel. If you have other topics to cover, you can go ahead. Otherwise, I have one question for Roy, but don't want to steal the mic to you.
Well, one of the questions I sometimes get is about kind of where ADF fits into this picture.
I think it's a good question.
Yeah, yes, it is. And at the moment, the ADF guys are working on the process and content use cases for their first release. We expect the governance capabilities to follow behind that. But we're still trying to work out where that fits in to the whole. So I'd say, you guys watching this have any ideas of how you'd like to build an ADF app that includes governance capabilities, let us know what that looks like, and kind of you can work with us and we can see how we can can make that happen.
One question I would like to, no, please, do you have something to add, David? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's the general point, actually. We're always keen to hear feedback, especially from community users who may not have other communication or touch points within Alfresco. Feel free to reach out to us, let us know how you're using RM and specifically what you're doing with it and how we can help you do that better. That would be really useful for us, because the more we know about how you use it, then the easier it is for us to make decisions about how to develop it going forward.
I would like to raise my personal question. I have one question too, and feel free to take the mic because I think it's an open question for all of you guys, David, Tom, and of course Roy. In your experience, which are the most common use case or scenario where the governance services is used in our customer, in our community, in our installation in general? Of course, the most common scenario that you are aware of, because as David was saying, that it depends also. So there is a bunch of installation from the community that we are not aware of. But in any case, which are the most common use cases, scenarios that you are aware of using governance services?
Sure, and you guys can chip in. That's a very good question, actually, and I'm hesitating because it really does vary. I think traditionally, up until probably fairly recently, this really was the records management team. So the primary use case was to manage records. In terms of, if you like, the type of customer that would tend to use it, you would find that they are predominantly sort of government or federal customers, obviously, because there's always a pressing need to be able to control sort of content for obvious reasons at that level. But we also see other kind of regulated industries kind of tracking behind. So finance is another good example. But primarily, those use cases are around records management, and they are, I don't want to say they're kind of electronic record management kind of use cases, where it's more usual that we will be, in my experience, replacing an existing electronic records management system with our more modern approach, because if you like, those companies have transitioned from paper to a electronic paper replacement, and then realize that actually there's limited kind of benefit to that, because you're just replacing like with like. And what we try and offer is, if you like, the next step, if you like, in that kind of that transparency and automation. So I think that's probably the most, in my experience, the most common thing you see. What we're rapidly seeing now is a much wider adoption, I think, and that's because of our approach to take a whole repository view or a whole platform view of governance, which is why you've seen that internally you've seen the team kind of change its focus from just RM to this wider kind of governance focus. And you'll see when we look at things like marks and classifications, and going forward things like holds and retention, you'll find that those things will be applied across the whole platform. So not just to records, but also to content and to process eventually. And that's really kind of widened the adoption. So customers we're coming through kind of, now are able to use a wide range of that, right? They can go for a pure records management kind of capability all the way through to a kind of pure kind of, classification. So I think we're going to see a change, a broadening of that kind of focus over the next couple of years as we kind of enable people to do that. I don't know if that answers your question, Francesco.
Definitely, yes. Of course, I have also other related question. If just the latest one, because we have few minutes and we are waiting for the latest question from the IRC or the YouTube channel. But can we say that governance services is not only for public sector or huge companies? Which is your opinion on that?
Yeah, my personal opinion is absolutely. I mean, I think I guess it's very similar to what we saw in the early days about Alfresco, right? Traditionally, content management was only for large organizations because the software was inaccessible. I think Alfresco's done a lot to combat that, right? Same with process services. We want to do the same for governance services. You know, everybody in an organization has information they want to keep sacred, they want to restrict access to. Everybody maybe has some level of compliance requirements, even if it's just for their taxes, right? So we want to be able to kind of commoditize this to the extent where it's simple enough for everybody to use. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're going down the right route. And I think over the next year or two, as you see some of these services become even simpler and apply across a broader spectrum of the platform, that's when people will be able to just kind of pick and choose the bits that are relevant for them and really start to use them. So I'm hopeful that it will come out of that kind of niche of kind of federal large organization to really be just an everyday tool that organizations can use.
Thank you, Roy, and of course, thank you guys for the explanation. Really useful for me, for sure.
No problem.
Kristen, do you want to take the? We don't have any more questions from the audience, and we are on top of the hour. Probably we can thank the people and close the session. We cannot hear you, Kristen. Okay. If you agree, I can say hello. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank you all the team, Roy, David, Tom, but not in this order, all together. Thank you very much for the explanation. Really interesting. Thank you very much, Kristen. Just a reminder about the hackathon that will happen the 22nd of September. Please join. That will be with us. Thank you again, guys. It's been interesting to understand more about governance services. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.